Welcome to What You Don't Know, the podcast that dives headfirst into the surprising, the overlooked, and the misunderstood. Hosted by a curious duo and one man, one woman, we explore the world's most fascinating ideas hiding in plain sight. From science and religion to politics, psychology, history, and everything in between, we shine a light on the knowledge that's publicly available but rarely discussed. Each episode is a deep but never dull conversation that challenges assumptions, sparks new perspectives, and reveals just how much more there is to know, especially about the things you didn't even know you were missing. Whether you're a skeptic, a seeker, or just someone who loves good conversation, this show will leave you thinking, questioning, and most importantly, knowing.
When you picture the Cold War, you probably think of tense standoffs, spies, maybe some high-tech weapons. But what if I told you the U.S. government seriously looked into something straight out of science fiction?
Right, like mind powers as a potential weapon or, well, an intelligence tool.
Exactly. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into the declassified story of U.S. government research into extrasensory perception, ESP, for spying. And we'll focus mainly on this one program, Project Stargate.
It's a pretty wild story. We've sifted through declassified CIA files, and there's a good recent article looking back at it all.
Yeah, lots to unpack. So our mission today is basically figure out how this started, what these psychic spies were actually doing, and, what the government finally decided about the whole thing. Okay, so where did this idea even come from? Early 70s, right?
That's right, early 1970s. It seems the main trigger was a classified report that landed on some important desks. It claimed the Soviets were really pouring resources into ESP and psychokinesis, moving things with your mind for espionage.
Whoa, okay, so the classic Cold War fear. What if they have something we don't? Especially something, well, unpredictable like psychic powers. That must have caused a stir.
It definitely did. The paranoia was real, so the CIA's response was pretty direct.
Yeah.
Start their own secret research. That kicked off in 1972 out at the Stanford Research Institute, SRI, in Menlo Park, California.
That's all right, okay. And wasn't there a pretty famous, maybe even infamous figure involved early on, Uri Geller?
Ah, yes. Uri Geller. The name probably rings a bell for many. He was an ex-Israeli paratrooper who'd become like a global celebrity in the 70s for his supposed psychic gifts.
The spoon bender, I remember seeing clips of that. Forks twisting, keys bending. It seemed pretty dramatic.
Extremely dramatic. He was all over TV. But the CIA, according to our sources, wasn't so much interested in the cutlery theatrics.
No. What were they after them?
Well, they were apparently more interested in his claims about mind projection. Could he project thoughts, maybe influence things or people from afar? That had, potential national security implications they wanted to explore.
Right.
The declassified docs really highlight this angle.
Huh. It does make you wonder, though, bringing in someone famous like Geller, did that help or hurt the credibility early on, given the whole showman aspect?
That's a really good point. It certainly added,
Yeah.
let's say, a layer of public fascination, maybe even spectacle. But yeah, the focus wasn't on, like, psychically jamming Soviet radar by bending antenna parts.
Okay, good. So more about intelligence gathering or influencing thoughts.
More along those lines, yeah. Actually, one of the articles mentions that Geller took part in some classified tests, psychokinesis tests, in winter 75. And get this, it was at a lab in Livermore, California.
Livermore, isn't that a major weapons lab?
That's the one. Involved in advanced weapons tech. So you've got psychic tests happening alongside nuclear weapons research.
No.
Pretty strange bedfellows.
Definitely strange. What did they have him do? Bend classified documents.
Well, one specific CIA experiment is described where Geller was in one room. Someone in another room drew a picture, and they just told him a picture had been drawn. He then apparently drew a square with diagonals through it, the same image.
Okay, that's interesting, if true. Results like that must have kept the funding going, at least initially.
It seems so. It fueled that early curiosity, this idea that maybe there really was something there, something worth exploring, despite how unconventional it seemed.
All right, so this early phase is happening at SRI, involving people like Geller, but the project name everyone remembers is Stargate. When did that happen?
Yeah, the name changed later. In the late 70s, the CIA actually backed away from direct involvement. The whole program shifted over to the U.S. Army, based at Fort Meade in Maryland.
Fort Meade, home of the NSA.
Right. And the funding primarily came from the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA. It was under the DIA that it officially got the name Project Stargate.
Got it. So it moved from the CIA to Army D oversight. But the core idea persisted, right? This belief that psychic abilities could be useful.
Absolutely, kept going for years. And you get a sense of why from people like Representative Charlie Rose. Back in 1979, he was talking about this research, and he called it potentially a hell of a cheap radar system.
A cheap radar system made of minds.
Sort of, yeah. His worry was explicit. What if the Soviets have this psychic radar and we don't? That's a big strategic disadvantage. It really shows you that Cold War mindset.
No kidding. Always looking for an edge. So Stargate is officially running. Who are the people actually doing the psychic stuff? The remote viewers, right?
Exactly. That was the term they used, remote viewers. Individuals believed to have psychic abilities who tried to, well, view distant places or hidden information using just their minds.
Were there any star players? Anyone particularly noted for their work in the program?
One name that comes up a lot is Joseph McMoneagle. He was an Army veteran, and one source says he was involved in something like 450 remote viewing missions between 78 and 84.
450, that's a lot. Did he have any claimed big hits?
He did claim some significant ones, like supposedly helping locate American hostages held in Iran. Another time, identifying a hidden shortwave radio that belonged to a suspected KGB agent captured down in South Africa.
Those sound impressive, definitely useful if they checked out. But how solid was the proof? Was it just his word, or was there independent confirmation?
And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Verification is often the tricky part with these claims. People in the program often cited these as successes, absolutely. But getting clear, unambiguous, external proof, that was often much harder to come by. It's still debated.
Right. Always comes back to proof. Any other examples that stood out?
There's another viewer mentioned, Angela Del Fiore Ford. In 1989, she was reportedly tasked to find a former customs agent who'd gone missing, on the run. She apparently described his location as Lowell, Wyoming, with pretty good detail.
And was he there?
Well, he was eventually caught, but about 100 miles west of a place called Lovell, Wyoming. So close, but maybe not quite pinpoint. Still, cited as a success story within the program.
Intriguing anecdotes, for sure. But let's shift to the program itself. We looked at that DIA document from '94, laying out their research plans. It sounds like they were trying to be more systematic by then.
Yes, exactly. That document, the Project Stargate Research and Peer Review Plan from May 1994, it gives you a much clearer picture of their later goals. It shows they were trying to approach this more, well, scientifically, or at least using scientific language and frameworks.
So it wasn't just sending psychics on missions and hoping for the best. There was actual research happening.
Definitely. The document lists several key objectives.
Yeah.
First, they wanted to figure out the basic mechanisms behind what they called AMP, anomalous mental phenomena. That was their term for ESP, psychokinesis, all that stuff.
Trying to understand how it might even work.
Right. And second, they wanted to know its limits. How useful could AMP really be in actual intelligence operations? You know, the practical side. Could you rely on it?
Makes sense. What else?
Well, they were also looking at foreign threats. Were other countries developing psychic abilities that could be used against the U.S.? And if so, could they develop countermeasures?
Psychic defense. Wow.
Yeah. And they wanted to use any findings to improve their own operations, plus figure out how to combine psychic intel, if they got any, with regular intel. They called that data fusion.
That sounds surprisingly structured, almost like a regular research program, just on a very weird topic.
It really does. The document stresses needing both internal and external experts, needing peer review, getting other scientists to check their work, and involving lots of different fields like psychology, physics, cognitive neuroscience.
You mentioned figures and appendices in that document, too. What was in those?
They had charts and outlines. Figure 1 gave an overview. Figure 2 listed the objectives we just talked about. Figure 3 showed how they planned to integrate different scientific disciplines. Figures 4 and 5 laid out milestones for basic research, understanding the how and applied research.
Yeah.
Can we use it?
And the appendices, just more detail.
Lots more. Details on what Congress told them to do, a glossary of all the weird terms they used, lists of universities and labs they thought could help, a big bibliography of scientific papers and journals they were looking at, even lists of who was on their oversight committees. It paints a picture of a pretty serious, if highly unusual, government effort.
It sounds like they're really trying to put a scientific coat on something pretty slippery. But did anyone outside the program, kick the tires on this, check their work? You mentioned a science panel report earlier.
Yes, there was an important external review, the SRI Studies in Remote Viewing, a program review. This science panel report came out back in March 1984. Their job was specifically to look at the research done at SRI.
Okay, so an independent look. What did they find? Did they buy it?
They were cautious, very cautious. They acknowledged that, yeah, sometimes results in experiments looked impressive, maybe statistically significant, but they raised big red flags about the overall evidence for ESP itself, and especially about whether remote viewing was reliable enough for actual intelligence work.
What were their main concerns?
Two big things, really. One, they pointed out there was no clear understanding of how it could possibly work. No known mechanism for transmitting thoughts or images like that. And two, the huge problem of observer bias. Were the researchers maybe seeing what they wanted to see? Were the results being interpreted too generously?
So basically, interesting anomalies, but don't bet the farm on it for spying.
That's a good way to put it. They noted the inconsistency. Sometimes it seemed to work, sometimes it didn't. Could you really base critical decisions on something so flaky? They doubted it. They felt it wasn't dependable enough for actionable intelligence.
Okay, fast forward again. We get to 1995. By then, some of this is leaking out, right? More public attention.
Yeah, the secrecy was eroding through the 80s and early 90s. Leaks, rumors. It was becoming harder to keep it completely under wraps. And then came the big one.
Right.
A formal evaluation, sponsored by the CIA itself, done by the American Institutes for Research, AR. That report came out in 1995.
And that was the final nail in the coffin. What did the CIA's own review conclude?
Pretty much, yes. The AR report, commissioned by the CIA, finally officially acknowledged the government had been working with remote viewers. But the bottom line was blunt. Project Stargate was judged a failure.
A failure. After all that time and money, why?
They concluded it was still unclear if remote viewing was even a real paranormal phenomenon. That fundamental question hadn't been answered satisfactorily after more than 20 years.
Wow. So still couldn't prove it was real, let alone useful.
Exactly. The report did concede, similar to the 84 panel, that some results seemed statistically significant, suggesting something more than just chance might be happening sometimes. But, and this was the killer, the information obtained was consistently too vague and ambiguous.
Vague and ambiguous, meaning you couldn't really act on it.
Precisely. It wasn't providing actionable intelligence. You might get a feeling, an impression, a fuzzy image, but not the specific, reliable details needed for intelligence operations. And based on that conclusion, the program was shut down.
So intriguing hints, maybe some statistical oddities, but ultimately not a practical tool for the government's purposes. Did that 1995 shutdown completely end all government interest in this kind of thing, though?
Well, officially, Stargate ended. But the curiosity didn't vanish entirely, it seems. One of our sources mentions, for example, an Office of Naval Research program as recently as 2014 that was looking into intuition, like that sixth sense among sailors and Marines.
Huh. So maybe exploring the edges of human perception, just under different labels perhaps. Less psychic, more intuition.
Possibly. And you had figures like Dr. Edwin May, who used to head the research for Stargate. Even after it closed, he kept arguing that ESP was a legitimate tool. He pointed to a study he did later, funded by the Bible Foundation in 2015, claiming it might be the best evidence yet.
So the debate kind of continued, at least among some researchers. And it's interesting, too, that Gallup poll from 2005, our article mentioned, it showed a lot of ordinary Americans still believe in ESP and paranormal stuff, right?
That's right. Public belief is often quite separate from rigorous scientific validation or government assessments of operational usefulness. That poll suggested a significant chunk of the American public felt there was something to ESP, regardless of what the official reports said.
Okay, so let's recap this deep dive. We started with the Cold War, this almost sci-fi idea of psychic espionage bubbling up because of Soviet rumors. That led to decades of secret U.S. government research, first at SRI with figures like Uri Geller, then morphing into Project Stargate under the DIA.
Right. We saw the remote viewers like McMonigle undertaking missions with some claimed successes but major questions about proof. Then we looked at the internal efforts, like that 1994 plan, to try and make it more scientific, study the mechanisms, assess threats, develop countermeasures.
But the external reviews, like the 1984 science panel, were pretty skeptical about reliability. And ultimately, the CIA's own 1995 report concluded Stargate failed to deliver actionable intelligence, leading to its shutdown.
Exactly. I think the big aha moment here is just realizing the sheer extent the government went to explore this, pouring millions into investigating psychic phenomena for national security. It's pretty mind-bending in
It
itself.
really is. So
So-
wrapping this up, here's a final thought for you, the listener. When you consider all this declassified information and ambitious goals, the strange experiments, the cautious reviews, the final shutdown, what does it tell us about intelligence gathering itself? About how far agencies might go? What about our fascination with the unknown and just how hard it is to scientifically prove or disprove extraordinary claims? And maybe what's next? Could unconventional ideas like this ever find a place again? Definitely gives you something to think about.
And that's a wrap on this episode of What You Don't Know, You Don't Know. If your brain feels a little fuller or like it just stumbled onto something way more interesting than expected, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss next week's deep dive into, well, something you didn't even know you didn't know.